and welcome to Bible Study Hub. I'm Anne, and I'm so happy to be with you tonight. Tonight, I actually had to pre-record our lesson because I got scheduled to work during Bible Study Hub time. So if you're watching this live at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Facebook or YouTube, know that you are with others who are watching it live, but I myself had to pre-record this, but it should feel pretty normal. So go ahead and comment with each other and interact like you always do. That would be great. So we're in Genesis chapter 15 again tonight, and I'm really excited about this evening because we get to study the Abrahamic covenant, and it is so mind-blowing. I hope we can fit it all in to the short time that we have together. So let me give us a little bit of an intro, a little bit of a running start like we normally do. So Abram, our character here, who becomes Abraham later on, and Sarai, his wife, who becomes Sarah later on, had a wonderful, amazing, against all odds victory last week when we were talking about how he got his 300 plus men, went on this military excursion. He rescued his nephew Lot. It was amazing. God was with him as he won this against all odds battle. He gets back, and the first thing that we read in chapter 15 is that God comes to Abram and he says, Abram, don't be afraid. I'm your shield and your reward. And we just talked a little bit last week about how maybe Abram, when he got back from this military wipeout that he created, with God's help, was wondering, is there going to be retaliation? Am I really safe? Are they going to come ambush me and my family at night? And he may have started to get worried about these things. And God comes to him and he says, no, you don't need to be worried. I've got you. And that's the nature and character of our God, is to tell us not to be afraid because he's got it covered, not because we have to try harder. Well, at that point, Abram says to God, I don't have any offspring. How is this all going to happen? And God says, well, I want you to look up at the stars, count them if you can. That's what your descendants are going to be like. So we're going to take it from there, and we're going to talk about the Abrahamic covenant tonight. Now, before we go through the passage, I want you to know there are some implications here that we don't readily grasp in our culture unless you really understand covenants and covenants in this time period. So we will be spending quite a bit of time just kind of breaking that down, culturally speaking, because when we do that, it's like the light just goes on, and all of a sudden something that was really cool on the pages of scripture before just becomes absolutely jaw-dropping amazing. So let's go ahead and get into the passage. We are going to pick it up in chapter 15 of Genesis, and we're going through verses 7 to 11. So you can open up your Bibles or online there. And here we go. And he said to him, this is God, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you the land to possess. But he said, Oh Lord, how can I know? How am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all of these, cut them in half, that's Abraham did this, and laid them half over against each other. But he did not cut the birds in half. They were probably too small to cut in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. Okay, so let's break this covenant thing down in this Old Testament ancient period of time. So, as you probably suspect, there were no legal documentation things to do. There was no legal Zoom. There were no lawyers. And so, when people wanted to make a covenant, two parties wanted to make a covenant with each other, they would get animals, they would slaughter the animals. Then, when the animals were dead, they would cut them in half. They would put the carcasses on two sides and create kind of a pathway. And then they would begin to walk up and down the pathway. But before they did this, they would always have kind of a preamble where the parties would introduce themselves. Did you catch that, what we just read? I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. That's what God was doing here. Let me establish who I am. That's part of the typical preamble. What they would say when they would pass back and forth between the pieces of animals, they would recite the pieces of the covenant that they were going to keep up with each other, that they were promising to do. And the reason that they walked up and down between these cut animals is because what they were really saying is, if I don't hold up my end of the bargain, may what happened to these animals happen to me. May I be cut off. May I come to complete and total end and utter disaster. In fact, God himself references this in Jeremiah chapter 34:18. I thought this was interesting. It says, "And the men who transgressed my covenant and did not keep the terms of the covenant that they made before me, I will make them like the calf that they cut in two and pass between its parts." So God is saying that very thing at that moment is, if you don't keep up the covenant, may you become like the animals that were cut. And they would say cutting a covenant. We say make a covenant. They actually in this period of time would say, let's cut a covenant. And that's why they did that. Here's where this covenant just gets really mind-blowing. And I have to be honest, I had never really thought this far into it until this past week when I was studying this in depth. All of a sudden, it hit me, wait a minute. Usually, even today, covenants and promises are made between two basically equal partners. I mean, one may be in a slightly different position than another one, but for the most part, they're equals, they're peers. What we see here in Genesis 15 is not that. What we see is a very unbalanced power structure. We have the God of the universe, so we'll say in authority, kind of in the position of a king, if you will, making a covenant with just a regular guy, Abraham. There's a huge power differential in that um, situation. I did a little study. Did that ever happen? Was this normal in this time period? And it was super interesting. I have to share this with you. So, no, it was very rare that someone, will just say like a king, someone in the status of a king, would make a covenant with his underling and one of his subjects. Maybe it was a servant, maybe it was a vassal, whoever it was, but definitely under him, like in his kingdom, but not nearly at the level that the king was. Very rare, but once in a while, history reveals it did happen. And when it happened, there was always a little indication, kind of in the preamble when there was the introduction, that the king would make that would establish why the subject would have, oh, let's say, would owe the king something. So he would say something about the benefits that he had bestowed on the subject in the past that would then create a situation where that subject would feel like he needed to make this covenant with the king in order to honor all the wonderful things that the king had done for him. And then out of gratitude, the subject would seek to fulfill the king's wishes. Okay. So when those stipulations were given in the cutting of the covenant, it was always the subject talking about what he, or presumably she, whoever it was, would do for the king. But it was not what the king would do for the subject. It was already established that the king was in power, that the king was over the subject as it was, and that the subject owed himself, his stuff, whatever it was, to that king. So the subject would walk back and forth and create this covenant and talk about all the things he was going to do for the king. Maybe it would include that he wouldn't have any alliances with any other king. Maybe it would include some sort of monetary tribute that he needed to make. Maybe it meant appearing before the king once every year to kind of indicate where he was with the follow through of whatever it was he was promising. So it would always end with the deities, because they were, not Abraham, but at this point, but we're talking about just general historical events here. They would kind of invoke the deities of both parties and possibly other deities out there that might exist, so that they had sworn by the highest possible means they could, and they had covered all the bases so that the subject could never come back and say, I declare by the deity of so and so's tribe, one of our enemies, that they worship that god. They covered all the bases. So they invoked all the deities. So I hope this isn't getting bogged down. It's just when you kind of start to understand this, and some of you already are starting to think, oh my goodness, I'm putting some things together here with what's about to happen that I never put together. It really enriches the experience, because what God is about to do is not culturally normative at all. Now, covenants, yes, culturally normative. Abraham, when God says, I want you to go get the three heifers and the goats and all this and the birds, Abram knows exactly what's going on. This is not outside of the realm of normal life. He knows there's going to be a covenant, and that he has to sacrifice, not sacrifice, but kill them, and then cut them in half and put the halves, and then he, I assume, would presume that then God will have him as the subject under the much, 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 much higher king, walk back and forth and just state whatever it was that God wanted him to do for him. And Abram was, of course, willing to do this. So he goes, he obeys God, he gets the animals, he does exactly what God says, he lines them up, and then he waits for God to tell him what to do. He's just waiting. If we were live right now, I would be asking a question. I'm just going to go ahead and ask it. If you want to answer amongst yourselves, you can do that, but I'll keep talking here. When I first read that, it says that the birds of prey came down on those carcasses, and Abram was back and forth shooing these vultures and birds of prey away. I mean, you can picture this in your mind, right? He's ready. He's got the covenant ready to go. And typically, if it were between two human beings, you would have both parties right there. So you don't have this problem of birds coming down, because you've got people walking back and forth and keeping them at bay. But in Abram's case, he didn't have that. He's waiting for God to somehow show up. And it's real quiet right now. And those birds are looking at those carcasses saying, that looks like dinner to me. And so this older gentleman now is running back and forth. He must have looked kind of silly. I don't know if he took off his robe and maybe he was trying to just shake it at them and shoo them away. But when I first saw that, I thought, why would the Bible, that has such an economy of words, why would that part be stated? Isn't that interesting? Go ahead and comment amongst yourselves as you kind of think that through. Why do you think, of all the things that could fit into this very small, small book, it's not small, but when you think about everything that could have gone into the Bible that didn't go in, it's just a fraction of everything in the universe that's ever happened. Amongst that, why put in that Abram was shooing away the birds of prey? That must have some significance to it. So I'll go ahead and I'll tell you what I think. And then later I'm going to go back and read your comments, and I want to hear what you think. So it occurred to me that God is about to kind of knock Abraham out. That's not probably the best way to put it, but we'll read it in a second. He falls kind of into this sleep like state. He's aware of things, but he's almost like sleep paralysis. Like he's not able to respond. This fearful and dreaded like darkness falls on him, and he's kind of out of commission. And I think the reason that God would have had us read that right before this happens to him, he's running with, shooing birds off of the sacrifices, because God wanted to establish this was not some made up dream that he had. This is not Abram goes to bed at night, has a big dream about this whole situation, and then wakes up in the morning and goes, oh, that was weird. That felt real. He was there. He actually had carcasses. This is a real covenant. Birds don't come down in your, in dreams and you're shooing them away. I mean, you could dream something like that, but this actually happened. This is not a dream. He's not in a dreamlike state at this point. He's completely aware. He is completely mobile. He is totally with it. And he's just waiting for God. And I think God wants to establish that to say, okay, I want you all to understand this actually happened. It was a real event. This is not to be spiritualized and made into something else with some other meaning. It's for real. I meant it, and it happened. Okay, so let's go on. Okay, I'm looking at my notes here. So here's what we have. I referenced this a minute ago. So God starts out with a little preamble. In verse 17a, he says to him, I am the Lord. You would expect this. God is going to introduce himself. Then he goes on to kind of just state the relationship that he has with Abram, which is also normal. He says, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. Remember when we said a minute ago that if it was between a king and his subject, that the king would establish what he had done for the subject, that then would kind of endear the subject to the king, that the subject would say, yes, you have been gracious to me. Yes, you have given me things that I appreciate. So, yes, I am willing now to do what you ask. I will cut this covenant with you and I will do what you told me to do. This is where it goes off the rails a little bit because that's where the normative stuff stops. So, this is where God would show up and Abram would walk through and he would tell God all the stuff he was going to do for God. And then they would swear by the highest deity. We're about to read all of this stuff. So it's kind of hard to organize my thoughts. I apologize for that, but there's so much. There's just so much. When they swear by the highest deity, guess who that ends up being? Hebrews actually tells us. The book of Hebrews in chapter 6, verses 13 and 14, referring to this moment, says, For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, Surely I will bless you and multiply you. So even the idea that, yes, there was a deity invoked that was the highest deity possible to invoke with whatever the terms were, God invokes himself because he is not just the highest, but the only true deity. And I love how the Bible ties everything together. So you read that in Hebrews. And of course, the people in Hebrews would have been highly familiar with this whole covenantal process and the disparity between the king and the subject and how that would have gone. And so it's just really, really rich when you understand that. So now they're going to walk back and forth. At least Abraham thinks they are going to walk back and forth and they're going to give the terms of the covenant. And, Abram, I'm sure he's ready. Whatever you ask God, I'm ready to do it. Speak the word. Here we go. So here we go. This is a little bit of a longer section, but I want to break this up. So verses 12 to 20 of chapter 15. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. By the way, does anybody know what that was? Do you remember? Read the book of Exodus. That is Egypt. And yes, that is exactly what happened. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. That means you will die in peace, and you will be buried at a good old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, okay, here comes the actual walking back and forth of the covenant. Behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. Stop there for just a second. Does anybody read that Abram is walking back and forth? No. Where is Abram? The Bible is clear. He's off on the side in a stupor, not able to respond, not able to get up, not able to walk. He's aware, but he can't participate. God has put him out of commission. And there, I've got goosebumps. There in the middle of these cut animals with this cut covenant appears a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch, and it passes back and forth between the pieces. And this is what the Lord says at that moment. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, Kadamites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Okay. Do you remember when we talked about Christophanies? If you were with us in the book of Daniel, we talked about what a Christophany was. And a lot of you have said, I never knew that before, but I'm so happy to know now. A Christophany is just a pre incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. So Jesus appearing in the form of a man in the Old Testament before he had ever appeared on the scene in the New Testament. That's a Christophany. This is not that because we don't have a person appearing. This is what we would call a theophany. And it's kind of the same thing. It's when God the Father, who is a spirit, manifests himself as something visible to some sort of human or to humankind. That's a theophany. And that's what we have now. So God shows up in the form of smoke and fire, and it passes back and forth by itself, by himself, I should say, as he is reciting the terms of this covenant. This never, ever happens. Do you understand what just went down here? This is the king. This is the way, way higher up in that power differential. Abram being way down here, a subject, God being the king, way up there. The king never himself alone walked back and forth and made promises to the subject. It's unheard of. I feel kind of emotional about this. Honestly, this is surprising me a little bit. I feel like I'm kind of trying to hold back tears. Here's the reason why it's making me emotional, because that is our God. I read so often in the Bible how God condescends to us. You know, he doesn't have to do that. He didn't have to do this. In fact, God knew this was going to go really bad because Abram himself is a sinner and he's going to fail on certain levels. And then he's going to have offspring who are also sinners and they're going to fail on many levels. And then they're all going to have offspring and they're all going to be sinners, just like you and I are. And they're going to fail massively in many, many ways and in horrific ways. God knows this. Why on earth would he ever do this? Why would he do this? Why would he be the one walking back and forth making the promises? It just didn't happen that way. That's not how it was supposed to go. It reminds me of when we were in the book of Luke and we talked about the prodigal son. Remember, we said that the father who represented God was watching for that horrific son to come back. And when he saw him, he ran to him. And at the time, we said noblemen did not run. They had to pick up their robes and expose their legs. That was very dishonoring. That was horrible. They did not run. And this is a picture of God running to us, the sinner. This is a picture here of God condescending himself, putting the subject on the side and saying, I, as the king, will make the promises to you. And it doesn't matter what you do. I keep my promises. I don't lie. That's what just happened here. The Old Testament is so rich with information about God. It is so important that we study it and that we study it in depth because you're going to pick up things like this that just make it kind of like sits you back in your seat and you just go, I'm just undone. I don't even have words. How is this? How is this our God? And by the way, you will never find another deity in any other world religion who acts like this. Only our God condescends himself over and over and over again out of pure grace to people like you and me and Abram, who are sinners and failures. Wow, unbelievable. Let me just point out one other thing here. There's so much here. You know, you could never plumb the depths. But there's one other thing that kind of made me sit back and go, really interesting. And that is God's foresight in how he establishes his presence. It's a pillar of smoke and it's a flaming torch. Do you remember in Exodus later on when the children of Israel were being led by God through the wilderness to the promised land? Do you remember how God manifested himself? It was by a pillar of cloud, which would look like a pillar of smoke. Smoke and clouds go hand in hand, right? And also at night, a flaming fire. And so those children of Israel who would have been exposed to this story by this time would have known their father Abraham and his story and this covenant. They would have been able to look back on this and say, that was God there. There he is now. We can trust him in that. We can trust him now. That's our God. Again, God way ahead, like millions of steps ahead of the game. Abram didn't know that when he saw it, but we know it looking back on it. All right, so he just made a big promise of land, the promised land. Did it ever come to pass? You might be wondering. Have they ever owned the land that God gave them? Well, not yet. There's a little discrepancy as to exactly where this is, but this is kind of a generally understood blacked out little portion of land here that we feel is pretty close to what God promised. It may go further south than that. We're just not sure. But you can see where Israel is today, and you can see where God made the promise of the land. Israel has never, ever even come close to owning and living in that land. So, what does that mean for us? Well, of course, you know what that means. God's just not there yet. He's just not done yet. Will they possess that land? Yeah. Are you kidding? God just promised, unilaterally promised that they would. So, yes, yes, that is still coming, and they absolutely will. Most likely in the millennial kingdom. But we've got our eyes on it. We're watching for it. We know it's going to happen. Well, let's move on to chapter 16. So, just as an intro to chapter 16, we won't get too far into this, but I wanted to introduce it to you. God has promised, obviously, many descendants to Abram and Sarai. Now, how do you get descendants? There's one key thing you have to have, and that's children, right? You don't get descendants if you don't have offspring, because that's where the descendants come from. At this point in time, Abram and Sarah have been told and promised you're going to have many offspring. Look up into the sky. The stars represent your offspring. They have nothing, they have no children. So Sarai decides to take matters into her own hands. So let's read what she does tonight. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. That's pretty bold to say. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So, after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. Hagar was a slave. Oh, those are my notes. I normally try to make a little dash so I know to stop reading. All right, so Hagar was a slave, maybe taken from a place somewhere in Egypt. Remember when they had fled to Egypt? That's probably where they acquired some servants and some slaves. And so Hagar was one of those. Now, I thought it was kind of ironic that Egypt was the place where Abram was like, sure, I'll share my wife with another man. And she ends up, Sarah gets married to Pharaoh. So then they end up taking Hagar when he finds out and basically kicks them out of the country and says, please leave. And they go back up. And then the woman that they got in that exchange ends up being one that Sarah is willing to share with her husband. Like all this sharing stuff is going on. And it just seems rather ill advised, wouldn't you say? Now, this is where I feel like for myself, I like to sit back and I go, oh, what was she thinking? Oh, Sarai, I would never do something like that. Do you ever just kind of like, you don't have to put up your hand or anything, but in your mind, it's kind of nice to get a little self-righteous once in a while when you read of some of the stupid things people did in the Bible, and you go, I would never do something like that. Oh, how could they possibly? And it makes us feel so superior. I know that I struggle just a little bit with that once in a while. This is one of those moments. But I just want us to kind of understand the culture of the time, not to excuse what she did, but just so we don't have that feeling of superiority, because there is a possibility that any of us ladies in that time might have done the very same thing. And this is why. Obviously, infertility is never something fun. Not today, not 5,000 years ago. Nobody likes that. But it carried with it back in these days more of a stigma than it carries in our culture today. People really believed that if a woman was barren, that she was being punished for something that she did by God or the gods or whatever it was. They really felt that barrenness was the woman's fault. She had done something, she had brought this on herself. And so not only did you carry with you just the sadness of the desire to procreate and the inability to do so, but you were really looked down upon by society. Here's the other thing. They didn't have jobs for ladies, and they didn't have 401ks, and they didn't have pensions, and they did not have social security. And so if your husband died and left you a widow in your older years, particularly when you were more frail and unable to do much, the only way that you could survive is if your children took you in and took care of you. So if you had no children and society in general looked at you and said, that's on you, honey. You messed all of this up. You're the one responsible for your own barrenness. We're not stepping in and helping, because then maybe the gods get mad at us for trying to mitigate your situation. She would be in big, big trouble when she got to the end of her life as an older lady. So there's a lot going on here that goes beyond just, I'm kind of sad. Now, here's the other thing that just kind of hit me. Sarai at this time is about 75. I kind of deduced that from different things in the next chapter and previous chapter. So she's about 75 years old. She'll live to be 127. So that's longer than today's expected lifespan, but not by loads. It's not like way back in the beginning of Genesis when people were living 800, 900 years. 127 is pretty good. So if you take like the average lifespan, and then you take and compare it with today, and then you take like today's average childbearing years, and you go like with an even ratio into their lifespan being longer, you would come up with the average age of menopause being about 80-ish. Now we know even today you have a nice wide swing on that. Some 51, I think, is the average. Some women are hitting menopause in their early 40s. Some will hit it in their mid to late 50s. So you have a range, but 51 for us, it would have been about 80 for them. All that to say this, she's 75. It seems to me, and I'm reading between the lines here, but it seems to me that maybe something has just snapped for her. She's been waiting for years for this child that God promised. And I just picture in my mind, Sarah every month, she's just hoping that maybe this is the month that she won't get her period and she'll be pregnant and she'll have this baby. And because we read over it so quickly, it's gone in a flash for us. Remember, this is month after month after month after month, year after year, every month. Oh, she gets her period. She's not pregnant. And the next month she's hopeful. Oh, it happens again. She's not pregnant. And then my guess is that right about now, she didn't get her period, but she's not pregnant. And all of a sudden she realizes, oh my goodness, I'm done. I've just hit menopause. I can't have children. I can't have any ever. I'm done. My body can't do it. And it's because it feels like she's hit this moment of utter desperation. And to be honest with you, it almost feels panicky to me. Now, if you've ever gone through menopause or you're currently going through menopause, I don't really have to go into a lot of detail about what hormones do. And we can blame hormones for a whole lot of bad decisions that we make as women, and possibly correctly. No, I'm just kidding. We're responsible for our decisions, but I'll tell you what, it messes with your hormones. And sometimes we do things that we might not do otherwise when we're in this state of flux. Okay. Not that I know about this, but I'm just saying if I did. Yeah. So we come to this point where Sarai is like, okay, it's over for me. I can't have children. I need to do something else. And so she devises that plan. Now, it's not a good plan, is it? Because God already has his plan worked out, and he's already promised them that he's going to do it. So I had to kind of sit back, and this was so helpful for me this week. So I'm gonna throw it out there in case there's anybody out there who, like me, tends to gravitate this way sometimes, menopausal or not. And that is that there are times in our lives when we hope for and pray for certain things, and it just feels like it's getting very long and it's quiet and nothing is happening. That was where Sarai was. Now, for us, God has not promised any of us an offspring that will become like the stars of heaven. So it's a little bit different. But let me just throw out a couple of examples, and maybe none of these hit you, but maybe you have one that I'm not talking about that you would let the Holy Spirit bring to your mind so that we can make sure that we don't make the same mistake that Sarai made by jumping the gun in panic and trying to do something for God when God has not ordained it. Maybe you're single and you prayed and prayed and prayed that God would just bring that person into your life, that man or that woman that loves Jesus as much as you do, and will be that partner for life that you can live life with and do life with. And you've prayed, and year after year has gone by, and you're still single. And maybe it has occurred to you, what am I waiting for? He's not gonna do it. He's not gonna send that person. There's lots of people out there I could marry. There's a lot of people I could have relationship with. So what? They're not quite where I am spiritually, or so what? We don't seem that compatible. We fight a lot, but it's better than being alone. I'll just pursue that. My word to you is don't do it. Don't be Sarai. Don't jump the gun. I know it feels long. If you listen to my daughter Noelle and her fiance Jordan's testimony that they shared a few weeks ago after just getting engaged, they both just said, basically, I had given up hope. I mean, not in those words exactly, but there's stories where I'd given up hope of ever finding anybody, especially in Seattle. And God, at the right moment, brought those two together in a very providential and amazing way. So I'm telling you, don't give up. Maybe it's something different. Maybe you live in an apartment and you want to buy a house, and the housing market is outrageous, and you keep wishing you could get a home, and you're still in this apartment, and you're looking around and you're going, I can't afford it. I know I'm going to have to bid more than asking, and I know I'm going to have to waive inspection, which is not wise. But you know what? I'm so tired of living in this apartment. I just want a house. And you're tempted to just go out and get the loan and just make it happen, because truly you could do that if you wanted to. I'm telling you, don't do it. I know it's hard. I've been in that spot. And God took for us, when we moved to PA, a whole year of four of us living in a two-bedroom apartment at the time that was really tiny, and it was really, really hard. And I had about come to the point where I thought, I can't live like this anymore. I just need some space and some privacy. I need to be able to walk out my door and not be in the middle of people and not hear things on either side of me. And God provided at the right moment a house we never could have dreamed of. I'm telling you, I'm so grateful we didn't just go make it happen. Don't be Sarah. Don't do that. Now, last example. Some of you are saying, yeah, I wish that were my problem. My problem, I can't fix if I wanted to. I'm praying for a health concern. I'm praying for a family member with cancer, or I'm praying for this autoimmune disease that I'm suffering with, and I've had it for so long, or I've been praying for this person for so long. And if I could jump the gun and heal them, I would. I can't. I can't do anything. And I'm just frustrated. And I feel like God is just saying no. And I'm just done. And I'm tired. And I'm just going to give up. And I'm not going to pray about it anymore. If that's where you are, again, I beg you, don't be Sarai. Don't do that. God is still working. And his timetable is not our timetable. And there are things that he's doing that we can't see, and there are purposes that we're not aware of, and there are things that he's doing in our minds and our hearts and in our lives that wouldn't be done any other way unless we walk through these trials. I hate talking about it because I hate those things. But I have to say, when I read this about Sarai, I just thought, what would our advice have been to her at this moment? If you could have said something to Sarai right now, like if you could just pop yourself right in there and speak her language, you would say, Sarai, don't do this. Don't give Hagar to Abram to have a child by. God has a plan. You just don't know what it is. I know. You think you're in menopause now, and so you see no hope. But what you don't understand is that God is not bound by that. He's still going to give you a baby. And by the way, you're going to have to wait like another 13 years. It's not even close. But you need to just settle down and trust God and be faithful and consult Him before you go making rash decisions. Well, Sarai didn't have us to give her that advice, and she's freaking out. And so she does this deed. She gives Abram her servant. By the way, in this culture, not unusual. They did not consider this adultery like we would consider adultery. They did not. That doesn't mean it wasn't. It just means in their culture they didn't think of it that way. If you had a slave, then any children that that slave bore were your property. So if Hagar had had a baby by another man, that child, assuming that she had gotten pregnant, that child would have been the property of Sarai. So when Sarai says this, she's just saying, let's just go with the cultural norms here. I need an offspring. God has prevented me. Did you catch that? Wow. Not God hasn't permitted me to have a child. God has actively made sure I don't. I hear a little bitterness there if I'm not reading into that too much. Anyway, she says, God won't let me have a child. Now I'm, assuming I'm menopausal. I can't anymore. I never will. So I'll solve this problem. We'll just do it the cultural way. Abram, take Hagar and you have children by her and they'll be mine. And Abram, oh my goodness, if only he had stood up and been the man of God for his family and said, "My dear Sarai, absolutely not. We are going to wait on the Lord. We are going to trust God for this. We know he will deliver. He's made this promise. He will keep his promises. My dear, I know this is so hard, but I love you. No, I'm not doing this." If only he had done that, right? On the other hand, God is sovereign and God is going to use this situation. I certainly don't want this to come across as if Ishmael, who is the father of the Arab people, as if they are somehow some gigantic mistake that should never have happened. And oh, we're so sad that they're around. I hope it's not coming across that way. God is sovereign. God knows what he's doing. And Ishmael will also be the father of many, many, many descendants. It's just that it's going to cause some problems, right, um, for Abram and his offspring, really up until even now. We have so many issues in the Middle East. So I want to leave you with this. John 5:17, Jesus talking says, Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." And I want to leave you with that thought that whatever that thing is in your life that seems so elusive, that God has just been so quiet on, and you've prayed about it for so long, and it feels like a no, and maybe it is a no, but maybe it's a wait. What we do know is this, that God is always, always, always working. Jesus is always working. It's not a matter of God forgot about you. He most certainly did not, or that he doesn't understand what you're feeling. He most certainly does. He knows, and he's got your best interest at heart. And so my word to you and to myself for those things, that thing, probably there's one major thing, is sit back, take a deep breath, continue to pray about it, but don't jump the gun and don't make decisions that are out of panic or trying to help God out because he's not moving fast enough. We will all do best if we can just sit back and say, "Okay, Lord, we understand that you've got this. Whatever your answer is fine with me. I will try to be patient. Please lead me along the path. Calm my heart. Help me to trust you. Help me to trust you more and walk that path with God." It is always the best way to go. Well, thank you for being with us on Bible Study Hub tonight. We'll pick it up right where we left off next Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Hopefully, we can do it all live together, meaning me with you live together. But thank you for watching the video recording tonight. And if you're not in our Facebook group, we would love to have you join us at Bible Study Hub on Facebook, nicest group in all of Facebook land. And if you ever need to go back and watch videos that you missed, our YouTube channel, Bible Study Hub, is the easiest place to find them all nice, neatly, and in order. All right. Well, I love you all. Hey, this is a great time to say, go make good decisions, right? That's what we ended with. So, team, go make good decisions this week. Trust the Lord. I love you. I pray for you. And I will see you again next Monday night.